Good evening, everyone. We're allowing people to enter the room, so just be patient. Give us a minute or two while we get everybody in in attendance. I hope everyone had a good afternoon today. It was a beautiful day in Northeast Ohio. We're blessed. Well, people continue to join. I'm going to say my name is Gwendolyn Mayer. Most of you know that. I'm the archivist at the Hudson Library and Historical Society, and tonight we're very fortunate to have one of our virtual author programs. Before we get too knee-deep into the program, I want to remind you all, in case you don't know this, we are featuring programs that are relative to China this month. So, for instance, this author tonight has a very pertinent tale to China. We also have organizations coming to the library. We have Five Lakes Chinese Music, which will celebrate the Moon Festival on the September 14th. We have the Lion Dance, the Steel Drum Kung Fu demonstration on September 21st. We have award-winning cookbook author Christina Chow, whose book is on Chinese enough homemade noodles for noodles, home-style noodles, excuse me, home-style noodle recipes for noodles, dumplings, and stir fries and more. We also have a virtual trip to the heart of New York City, Chinatown, and it's a live tour that's on Sunday, September 7th. We have the Cleveland Museum of Art will present 6 Chinese dynasties of painting. Our book club is reading the book River East, River West. And again, the Cleveland Museum of Art presents another art program at the end of the month on demons, ghosts, and goblins in Chinese art. That's on the 24th. So if you can attend any of these, we encourage you. You can register at the hudsonlibrary.org. And before we get started, very briefly, for those that aren't interested in China, which I think we all need to be a little more worldly, we have best-selling author Mary Trump coming to visit us on September 18th in person. We have a program by Pulitzer Prize finalist Annie Jacobson. She wrote a book about nuclear war, a scenario that's getting a great deal of wonderful reviews. She's coming this month. We also have Pulitzer Prize finalist H.W. Brands on America First, Roosevelt and Lindbergh in the Shadow War on September 25th, as well as Tracy Chevalier. Many of you in Hudson know Tracy. She's been here several times. She's going to speak virtually in September. And another New York Times journalist, Katie Rogers, who will speak on her book, American Women, The Transformation of the Modern First Lady from Hillary Clinton to Jill Biden. So I would encourage you to register for any of these programs at www.hudsonlibrary.org underneath programs. Now that we've gotten that out of the way and we have people that have joined, I think we have the bulk of the people that have joined. I'll introduce you this evening to another New York Times diplomatic correspondent, Edward Wong. He is the author of this evening's book, At the Edge of the Empire, A Family Reckoning in China. This is the book. If you don't know or haven't paid attention, it has been getting a great deal of wonderful reviews and has been he has spoken at a variety of places throughout the United States, as well as on NPR, I saw. And this wonderful book is an epic story of modern China that weaves together riveting family memoir that sort of has vital reporting even up to the current day, as well as an essential understanding of what China is today. It's the saga of a story in China, excuse me, a saga of a family in China from Mao until today, literally. And I read somewhere, Mr. Wong, that it took you 6 years to write this book. Is that true?
That is correct. It was a 6-year project. And when I set out to do the book, I wanted to write a book that would give the lay reader, the average person who might be interested in learning more about China but doesn't know a lot yet about China, a sweeping narrative that would draw them through Chinese history from the era of Mao when the Communist Party took over China to the current day, as you mentioned, to the present day where we're living and dealing with China as this new power on the global stage. So I started the book in 2018, 6 years ago, after I left my posting as bureau chief in Beijing for the New York Times. I'd spent nearly a decade there. And I thought to myself, how could I tell this compelling story of China? I mean, I know a lot about Chinese history, Chinese politics, and society, but how could I bring that to the average reader? And I thought that, well, within my family, there are certain stories that provide a compelling narrative that'll give readers a character to hang on to and to follow their journey from Mao era to today. And in fact, I decided I would do this through two characters from my family. One, my father, who's now 92 years old, and two, myself, and the journey that I went through when I went to China in 2008 for the New York Times. So I sat down and interviewed my father in depth about his time in China, and particularly his time serving in the Chinese army under Mao, which is the type of story that we rarely see discussed or talked about in historical narratives in the United States. And I also interviewed his family members, my family members, my uncle, his older brother, for instance, who ended up working for the US military instead. So they were two brothers on opposite sides of a geopolitical divide in the 1950s. And I also went through letters that my father had written. And then I read up a lot on history, the history of Mao during that time, the history of what he and his cohort did in China, how they ruled China. And I put that all together into this historical narrative set in the 1950s, an arc of both hope, my father's hope for how the communists might lead China into a better future, and then eventually disillusionment, how my father became disillusioned with the Communist Party, and then eventually had to make a very difficult decision to flee China, to flee the People's Republic, and return to Hong Kong, the British colony where he had been born. And then I paired that with my own narrative in China, where I went to China with some feelings of hope also in 2008. I think back in 2008, many Americans, myself included, thought that there was this great country rising there in Asia, and that would clearly play a dominant role on the world stage. And we thought maybe it has the potential to contribute to the world, to help advance certain aspects of foreign policy in the world, of diplomacy, of the world's economy, of scientific and technological development. And my sentiments on that changed through my years in China. Although I still very much respect the country, respect its people, and love the country, I also saw the Communist Party and its methods of governance in much clearer terms by the time I left. And the book documents that change in my attitude towards the people governing China, the leaders of China, and tries to grapple with what the party is today and the direction that China is going. And then, of course, it also addresses this looming issue for all of us, which is the rising tensions in US-China relations and where that might be taking both our country and the world. So in short, that's why I decided to write the book and the narrative arc of the book. I went hold up the cover again for a minute right here. And I first started learning about my father's time in the Communist Army, in the Chinese Army, when I was in my 20s in grad school. He rarely talked about his past in China. And when I was in grad school, I started studying more about Chinese politics and history and decided I would probe deeper into my parents' past in China, both my mother and my father. And at that time, when I was sitting in my childhood home interviewing my father about some of this, he pulled out this photograph of himself that he had taken in the early 1950s when he was in the army. And it's this photo right here, this portrait that's both on the front cover of the book and on the spine of the book of him in a People's Liberation Army uniform. And it's one of the two surviving photos of him in a uniform. He had this taken and mailed it to his father in Hong Kong. And his father took this photo, and what he decided to do was he decided to rub out the red star that was on my father's cap in the photo. So in the side, on the spine of the book, you see him wearing this cap, but there's no red star there. And my grandfather, his father, had decided to do that because he feared what the British authorities in Hong Kong might do if they caught my grandfather with this photo of his son in the Chinese army. So I think that episode, it talks or speaks to kind of the political conflicts and the contradictions that existed in the world during the rise of China under communism, and that existed in my own family at that time and still does to a certain degree now. So I thought I'd open by telling you that about my family, and we can discuss more about the book during this session. Thank you.
Unmute. I think I have to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine. Thank you.
It's my understanding your father might still be with us. He's 92 years old.
That's right. He's 92. When I first started interviewing him in depth after returning from China, he was in his late 80s. So we carried on these interviews through his late 80s as he turned 90. And he's 92. And I feel like I caught him at the right moment where he was still had many of his memories of that time in the 1950s, of the 12 years he spent in the People's Republic. He still remembers some very sharp moments from that period. And at the same time, he was distanced enough from that period to be able to talk about it openly with me. I think, maybe if I interviewed him when he was in his a much younger man, if he was in his 40s, for example, he might not have been as forthcoming about what he had done in China, about his emotions around joining the People's Liberation Army and eventually leaving the army and leaving China. And he might not have been as open about his efforts to join the Communist Party and his failure to do so. But I think in the late 80s, early 90s, he's far enough away from those events to be fairly transparent about them.
I have two quick questions. How does he feel about the book in general and maybe becoming a pseudo celebrity? And secondly, has he developed the pride as an American after all of this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he chose to come to America a few years after leaving China. So his brother, Sam, as I said, had decided to come to America. His brother, Sam, during the Chinese Civil War in the late 1940s, when the communists and the nationalists were fighting for control of China, his brother, Sam, got a scholarship to come to America after high school, after graduating from high school in China, and study here in America. So Sam studied at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., got a degree in engineering, then later got a master's degree, and worked first as an engineer in the U.S. Army, and then for several decades in the Navy. So Sam had always been wedded to this idea of America. And my father, after fleeing to Hong Kong in 1962, after becoming disillusioned with the communists and with Mao, he spent a few years in Hong Kong, studied as an engineer there too, then flew to America and to join Sam here and to join other family members here. And he became an American citizen early on. And my mom did the same. And they raised me in Washington, D.C. and the suburbs. I was born in Washington. So my father very much embraced America. I think he had seen in a very stark light, what the communists had done to China And I think he valued the freedom that he had in America once he came over here. And also, he could see the economic transformation, the economic progress that was happening in America. And back then in the 1960s, even Hong Kong, which today is this gleaming, financial center, even back then, Hong Kong's economy was lagging as a British colony in the mid 20th century. And my father decided that coming to America was the better choice in order to make a future for him and his family here. So he very much embraced that early on. As for your first question about, how he feels about becoming a celebrity, a minor celebrity, and about the book, I think he's very proud of the fact that I wrote this book. And he didn't have any hesitation about, telling me his life story. And I had him read through all the chapters involving him as I was writing the drafts of those chapters, because I wanted him to very carefully fact check the chapters and make sure I got everything right. I wanted to make sure I got the emotional reaction that he had to all the events in his life correct. I wanted to make sure I got the facts right. And so he saw the book as it progressed, or he saw the chapters involving him as it progressed. And then I handed him a galley copy, an early review copy of the book in the spring. And I think he was very excited to see that, and then gave him a finished copy of the book, a few days before Father's Day. So I think there was a great timing in that I got these copies in the mail shortly before the launch in late June, and was able to give it to him ahead of Father's Day. So he's very proud, I think, of the book and of the role he played in bringing the story of China out to the public, because I think he feels that there is a lot Americans can learn about China, and that he could be a vehicle for that, and that what he had experienced, the 12 years he had experienced in the People's Republic under Mao, could help educate Americans about China.
Which sort of leads me to my next question. How have the past years, especially with a great deal of anti-Trump, or excuse me, anti-Chinese, anti-Asian kind of feeling in the United States, how did that influence your writing of this book, and more particularly influence your life? Certainly you had a curiosity about your heritage, but did these anti-Chinese feelings figure into it at all?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I was obviously writing this book during a period when there was a hardening of the attitude towards China in Washington, among policymakers in Washington, that began during the Trump administration and has continued into the current administration. And as you mentioned, when Trump was president, he made some racist comments about Chinese citizens in China, and linked it closely to, the coronavirus and the pandemic. And I think it made me realize that part of the purpose that in me writing this book was to bring this fuller story of China and of Chinese citizens and Chinese American citizens out to the public, because I thought that the discourse on China, the conversation on China, is now in these very black and white terms. There's very little nuance to much of the conversation or the dialogue about China. And I thought that if I could publish this book-length manuscript, 400 pages, on China, on a person who is now, on two people who are now Chinese or Chinese American citizens, myself and my father, and show that they have these very complex interactions with China, very complex attitudes about China, then that might help broaden the conversation that we're having here in America about China, and also would help dispel some of the, sort of some of the irrational anti-Chinese feelings that have popped up in recent years, by showing Chinese Americans, especially immigrants like my father or my mother or my Uncle Sam, as these very fully fleshed out three-dimensional people who have gone through a history of turmoil with China, have complex feelings still about China, and but are very much American citizens and loyal to this country.
I have to unmute myself. I'm sorry. I read today somewhere in the news about the attempted suppression of the Mongolian cultures by the Chinese government. Um, I think it might have some similarities to when the United States tried to sort of suppress the Native American cultures, for example, here. There are many parallels between the Chinese civilization and ours, even though the Chinese seemingly date so much further back than us. I think sometimes we confuse the fact that Chinese government's actions represent the people's beliefs. Um, for example, I think the Chinese are a very patriotic country, as are the Americans, but we don't necessarily see um, some of the patriotism of the Chinese. So I'm trying to think of other parallels between these two amazing civilizations where we can come together and agree upon things. I think if you ask most Americans when we think about the Chinese, probably the first word that comes together is pandas. Um, and I thought it was very interesting in your book how you wove the pandas in and out of your family story. Could you speak a little to that and maybe some other cultural similarities where we generally see the same?
Right. Well, pandas, that's a funny thing you mentioned because my daughter, Aria, who's almost 12, is obsessed with pandas. And I wonder if it's because we brought her to a panda reserve when she was around 2 to 3 years old in China. It was the last trip we made as a family within China. We flew out to the southwest of China where there's a well-known panda research area in Sichuan. And so she's been very much obsessed with pandas. And I live, a few blocks from the National Zoo where pandas are essentially the mascot. They're kind of the mascot of Washington and D.C. in many ways. You see them all over the place because they've been at the zoo for a long time. They recently left the zoo, and the zoo is about to get a new set of pandas in. So you're right. Pandas are one of these symbols of cultural ties between the U.S. and China. They're, I think, one of China's most effective uses of soft power. I don't think it came about because of the government's necessary government policy, but I think they're just these naturally cute creatures that people around the world love. And the government has agreed to loan out pandas to different countries. Countries have to pay for the privilege, but I think the government sees some benefit to that. So yes, it's a symbol of the type of cultural bridge that can exist between the U.S. and China and other countries. Um, you know, Someone once mentioned to me, an American once mentioned to me recently that what's interesting about China is that there's a fascination among Americans and also other people outside of China with the culture of China. I think that's true. I mean, you look at the ways in which we're steeped in Chinese food, in discussions of things like Chinese New Year, in these practices that take place in certain times of the year. And as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, in even things like the lion dance or other rituals like that. And there is this fascination, I think, culturally of China in a way that doesn't exist necessarily with contemporary Russia, for example, which also exists in a state of tension with the United States. So I do think that that's one anchor for the relationship. And the thing you mentioned earlier about how the Chinese government is different than the people, obviously, it's the people that express most fully the culture of China and are the envoys of Chinese culture throughout the world, including the many Chinese Americans who live here in the US and the many Chinese immigrants that live here in the US and elsewhere. The government is very different. I mean, they emphasize the idea of Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, but it's still very much this authoritarian government that whose main priority is to stay in power, to consolidate its power. It exists, I think, less to try and be this full expression of the Chinese people. And so I think we have to keep that in mind, that very often, when I was reporting China during the decade there, I would often hear complaints about the Chinese people, about policies that local officials were imposing on the population, on people in different cities and in the countryside in China. Oftentimes they would praise the central government in Beijing because they thought the central government was looking out for their interests, but they thought local officials were undermining their interests. And so I think we have to keep in mind that the people of China have a very complicated relationship with their government and with their leaders. They do feel very patriotic or very nationalistic about China. They believe they come from a great country. They believe that great country should be a superpower in the world. So in that sense, they're very similar to Americans. I do find that there are these very close similarities between Chinese and Americans. There is this idea of exceptionalism that both Chinese citizens and American citizens possess. And I talk about this in my book, and especially in the prologue of my book, that American citizens often believe that there's a destiny for America, that is an exceptional country in the world, and that America has gifts to give to the rest of the world. And I think Chinese citizens very much feel the same way about China. And so part of the tension that exists now, I think, in the world is that we have these two countries whose governments, whose leaders feel the countries should be dominant powers on the world stage, but their citizens also feel the same way. And both sets of citizens take great pride in their countries. And so the question is how the two countries and the people of each country resolve this tension. I would say that for much of its recent history, Chinese citizens have looked up to America. They've admired America. Many of them are sad that there is this growing tension, geopolitical tension between the two nations. When I talked, especially to young Chinese, many of them, still feel some affinity for America. Many of them want to come study here. Some of them take a more nationalistic line and wonder why American leaders often badmouth China and push back against Chinese foreign policy. But there is still a strain of thought among many Chinese citizens that America is a country to be admired. And they know that America is a very powerful country, and they hope China can reach that level or have reached that level as well. So,
In American families, we often gather on a holiday or the dinner table or whatever the case may be, and usually politics unfortunately enters the topic. You covered 80 years in your book of your family. I would question, did politics ever become a heated discussion around your dinner tables?
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I mentioned in the book that when I was growing up, my father rarely talked about his past in China. My mother rarely talked about her past in China too. Her years in China was much more brief than my father's. She was a child when the communists took over in 1949, a young child. She and her family, they were they were a land-owning family in southern China. They experienced persecution very quickly under the communists. They were criticized by villagers who were sympathetic to the communists, and eventually they had their possessions taken from them. So then the family fled to Hong Kong, the British colony, in the 1950s. My mother was a child at that time. So that's her experience of the People's Republic. She didn't have the same arc of engaging with the People's Republic as a young adult and then moving from hope to disillusionment. So her memories of communist China are very dark ones. And when I was growing up, although my parents never really talked much about their past in China, I would catch snatches of conversation sometimes among them. And could sense that there was some tension between my parents, between the fact that my father at one point had embraced communism, whereas my mother from a young age had been very hostile to communism, had experienced being a victim of communism. And so there was this tension, even though my father eventually rejected communism, the fact that he believed in it in the 1950s at the same time that my mother was being persecuted by the communists, I think, was a tension at various points in the household I was growing up. But it was very unspoken. And I only learned more about it in detail when I interviewed my parents later on. So growing up at the dinner table, politics about China was not an overt topic of conversation. However, once I started interviewing my father about his past ones in my 20s, and later on, as I worked in China, came back home for visits, and then interviewed him for the book, he was very open to talking about politics. I learned that he was an avid reader of Chinese history, of Chinese politics. He still follows it closely today. And so we would talk very openly about Chinese politics and Chinese history and about his views on it. And those are all expressed in the book. He has complicated feelings, I think, about the current Chinese leadership. We've talked about Xi Jinping, the current leader of China. He came to visit me in 2012 in China when my daughter was born. And at that time, Xi was taking over as leader of China. And my father thought at the time that maybe Xi could get rid of some of the corruption that was endemic in the Communist Party at the time. I mean, I think many people, including my father, realized at that point that the communists had become very corrupt with the immense wealth that China had acquired. And my father said at the time in 2012 that the communists were probably as corrupt as the nationalists had been when the two sides were fighting the Civil War. And my father had supported the communists in his youth because he thought the nationalists had become too corrupt. But now in 2012, he's telling me, as we're sitting in Beijing, that he thinks the communists are corrupt. He hopes Xi will get rid of that corruption. And then fast forward to a decade later, when I'm talking to him in Washington about where China has gone, and he thinks that Xi Jinping is himself becoming corrupt with power because Xi has held on to power for more than 10 years. He held on to power for a third term as president, which broke the norm for recent presidents or recent leaders of China. And he thinks that Xi might be going down the route of Mao, that Xi might be holding on to power for too long, and that power might eventually corrupt him. So these are examples of how my father and I have talked very openly about Chinese politics and about how his views have shifted and how, even in recent years, and how he has these very complex views on Chinese history and politics.
How did he feel about the British leaving Singapore
Oh, leaving Hong Kong, you mean,
or
in
Hong Kong? Excuse me.
1997. Yeah. The second chapter of my book is about the departure of the British from Hong Kong. I was there in the weeks before Britain left Hong Kong, so I witnessed that firsthand. I witnessed the buildup to that firsthand. And I had family members in Hong Kong, a close cousin, Eugene, who saw it happen. And my parents, I think, they grew up in British ruled Hong Kong. They saw some of the benefits that the British brought to Hong Kong. At the same time, they also knew that the British never gave Hong Kong, Chinese residents of Hong Kong, a full democratic say in the running of the colony, that it was always ruled by Britain, and that the Chinese, even the ethnic Chinese, even if they were the majority of the population in Hong Kong, they never had the right of rule. So they had these very complicated feelings, I think, about the British in Hong Kong. They knew that there were certain benefits that the British had done by building up this infrastructure in Hong Kong that was based on things like rule of law, anti-corruption. But they also knew that the British never intended to give democracy to Hong Kong and never did. They left Hong Kong in the hands of the People's Republic rather than giving it sovereignty or ensuring that it had full democracy. And of course, we see where that's gone today. The People's Republic did not honor the promise they made to Britain. And in 2019, they decided to effectively end this system of governance that they had called one country, two systems, and instead move very quickly to bring Hong Kong under the norms of communist rule. And so in many ways, a lot of people regard the story of Hong Kong as one of tragedy in recent years, even though Hong Kong people are very adaptive and have a very vigorous spirit in terms of defending their rights.
You have had a very interesting perspective on China, its culture, its history through your family, through your work. Let's suppose in a pretend kind of world that you became the advisor to the president on Chinese American politics. What would you advise the next president to do to improve our relationship with China?
I mean, that's hard. I generally stay away from policy because I find it much easier, or at least I'm much more comfortable documenting the changes in the relationship rather than trying to think about how I would make policy. I mean, I think the one thing that I would tell US leaders is not to underestimate how patriotic Chinese citizens are, because I think that there is a risk in the US framing its China policy in a way that that makes feelings of hostility more come to the surface among a lot of Chinese citizens, hostility towards the US. I think the US does play a certain role in how Chinese citizens perceive it. And I think it can either stand as a symbol of a welcoming country, of a country that welcomes people from other parts of the world, especially those being persecuted by their governments. I think that's one tradition, yes. Or it can become a much more isolationist country that rejects that type of person, seeking refuge, seeking greater liberties. The same type of country, that welcomed my parents or other immigrants might decide to go down another path. And so, and also just adopt policies that really turn a lot of Chinese citizens against it. And I'm saying this in an abstract manner. I don't really have concrete examples I want to give right now of what those policies might be, because we're talking about a hypothetical in the future. But in any case, I think, US leaders should keep some awareness in their minds of the fact that Chinese citizens are patriotic. They want to see their country become a great country. They do think it deserves a place on the world stage on par with the United States. At the same time, they don't support everything their government does or everything the party does. And some of them are outright distrustful or hostile towards the party. So I think we need to keep all that in mind.
Do you have suggestions or recommendations for non-Asian Americans traveling in China?
Uh, I don't have any suggestions. I think I encourage people to go to China. Um, China does give out tourist visas, and I know people who've gone there recently on visits. I think that there's a lot you can learn about the country from being there on the ground. And I think that's pretty much been my mantra about journalism, that the best journalists only learn when they're there in the field on the ground. You don't learn nearly as much sitting behind a desk. You can learn from reading. I recommend reading to get the context before going to China. I think my book can help with that. And so that can provide you with a framework for understanding the country, but going there is very important. I would say that visiting the big cities is important: Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, cities in the middle of China like Wuhan, Chongqing, Chengdu, but also getting out to more rural areas and seeing what life is like there is also important too.
Do you have any comments about, I hate to ask this, but the alleged spy issue that's currently going on in New York? And do you think this is common for Chinese to put spies in the United States or government, industry, academia?
Yeah, as far as I can tell from the Justice Department indictment, she's accused of acting on behalf of the Chinese government. The indictment doesn't indicate she's a trained spy who was sent here from China, but it accuses her of essentially playing favorites, favoring Chinese government interests, and somehow shaping some of the actions in the governor's office in New York State around that. So it's not so much she's a traditional spy as that she was acting on behalf of the Chinese government. I think there's a difference between that. Your question about spies, I think, is a complicated one. I wrote a series of stories late last year, about the US-China espionage rivalry. So it's a topic that is very much on my mind. I do think that China does try to spy on the US. Obviously, we knew about the spy balloon incident last year, the one that floated over the US. That was my sources in Washington tell me that balloon was originally aimed at US bases in perhaps Guam and Hawaii, but unintentionally drifted over the continental US when the winds changed. But in any case, that's one method. The Chinese government does hack into US government servers, for example, or online services to try and get information. So there's cyber espionage. And it does have traditional spies in other countries abroad. Oftentimes, those spies will have diplomatic cover, so they're in the embassies or consulates of those countries. But at the same time, I would say that the US does exactly the same thing. It also engages in cyber espionage. The National Security Agency probably has better technology for engaging in cyber and electronics or signals intelligence than China does. And also we put spies in China and other countries around the world. So both countries are engaged in espionage against each other, just as the US and the Soviet Union were engaged in intense espionage. And I should say that, from my perspective, you also see even US partners or allies engaging in espionage against the United States or us against them, because we're each trying to learn what other countries are doing, even our allies. So, for example, in Washington, oftentimes experts on espionage will tell you that among US partners and allies, France and Israel have very advanced spying capabilities and are often trying to get information about the US. So, yes, China is trying to spy on the US, but we're doing the same to them. And countries around the world, including allies and partners, are doing all of this to each other.
Dee wrote that she really enjoyed your book. She had no background in Chinese history. She loved hearing about your Chinese family, and she wants to know if you have any recommendations for reading for future, and to keep in mind she's a novice.
Yes. I mean, I would say that um, there are some historians of China who have written very great books on China, and you can learn a lot from them. So one historian who's very readable um, is Jonathan Spence. He is a recently deceased historian who taught at Yale University. And I think many of his books on China are great reads on China and can teach you a lot. I would say 2 points to start with him are The Gate of Heavenly Peace, which is his attempt to write about the history of 20th century China and the revolutions and wars that took place through the eyes of Chinese intellectuals who were observing all of this or taking part in it at the time. Very readable book. There's a lot of human emotion in it because he's talking about all the things that happened to these scholars, intellectuals, thinkers, and their families. It's similar to the way I documented the changes to my family in my book. And he has his first book on China, I think, is a great read because it gets to the heart of US-China relations. And it's a book called To Change China. It was written, I think, in the late 1960s or early 70s. And it's about stories of different foreigners, Americans and others, who've gone to China through the centuries, starting from centuries ago up until now, and how each person sought to change China in some substantial way. But in the end, how it became very difficult to change China because of the complexities of living and working in China. And I think that book, To Change China, is a really important work for understanding China and its relationship with the world and how foreigners interact with China.
So, what's next? What's your next book? And we hope that it's not going to take another 6 years to get to. Or do you think it'll be more Hong Kong books? What are you working on?
You know, that's an interesting question about Hong Kong. I have very close ties to Hong Kong. My parents both are from there. And one thing that people ask me is, oh, why isn't your mother's story why doesn't it more represented in the book? And the reason, as I mentioned, is because she didn't spend a lot of time in the People's Republic. She left for Hong Kong at an early age, but then I think that, you know, her story might be a good way to tell some of the story of Hong Kong, as well as my father's story. So I could see a potential book about Hong Kong where I go back to family histories and tell a fuller story about Hong Kong, as well as about the transition from living in Hong Kong to living in America. And I think that many Chinese immigrants of their generation came from Hong Kong, came from Southern China, and then established themselves in Chinatowns here in the US and in the suburbs. And I think that that's a very dramatic history. I don't go much into details of their immigration here to the US and their early years in the US in my current book. I do touch on it, but I don't go into a lot of detail. And I could see a possible future book on that because I think it's a history of America as well as a history of Hong Kong as well. Um, I'm very much interested in America's role in the world. I reported on America in Iraq for 3.5 years. I talk about that a bit in the prologue of my book and in some other parts of my book. I report on American foreign policy now from Washington. So it's a topic that interests me a lot. Maybe there could be a potential book in the future on that. And I also love fiction. I was an English lit major at the University of Virginia. I often read novels in my spare time. So at some point, I might want to try my hand at writing a novel.
Catherine wants to know if you can speak to the relationship between Putin, the Ukrainian war, sanctions, and Tsai. So might
The
you address that?
relationship with China, between Russia and China in the
Yes,
current context.
yes.
Sure. I mean, China is a very close partner of Russia. That was historically the case. China and the Soviet Union had a falling out, which is why Nixon and Kissinger were able to engineer the opening between the US and China. And in recent years, China has grown closer to Russia for several reasons. I think, you know, part of it is both of them see the US as a rival power on the world stage, and they think that by banding together in certain ways, they can counter the power of the US. They also, both Putin and Xi are suspicious of US intentions toward their countries. They think the US wants to engineer regime change in Moscow and in Beijing. And so they harbor hostility towards America, I think, and towards American governments, whether it's a Republican or Democratic run administration. Um, and in recent years, starting in 2022, when Russia began the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, China first backed up Russia diplomatically on the world stage. It did not go against Russia like the US had hoped. Instead, it played a role trying to shield Russia in the United Nations in other venues from criticism. And in recent months, according to the Biden administration, it has given Russia machinery, factory tools, and microelectronics that have allowed Russia to rebuild its defense industrial base so that it has helped shield Russia from some of the impact of US-led sanctions. And so the Biden administration says, to a large degree, Russia's able to carry on its war in Ukraine because of this Chinese commercial aid. Now, US officials do tell me that China has not given weapons directly to Russia. It is not sending them arms to use in Ukraine because I think it still fears, to a large degree, the sanctions that the US and allied nations might impose on China if China were to do that. And I think that shows some hope for stability in US-China relations because it shows that China still cares about the economic power that the US wields, and it still cares to a degree about being seen as a rational and stable player on the world stage. So it's not fully throwing in its lot with Russia yet.
One more quick question. What are your thoughts regarding the relationship of China with Iran?
Well, China and Iran, I think, is a marriage of convenience. I mean, to a certain degree, that's true also of China and Russia, because I don't think they share deep ideological commitments to each other. And China and Iran certainly do not share that. Iran is a theocratic nation run by religious leaders. China does not see itself that way at all, of course. And I think that there's some convenience. There's a commercial relationship. China is a huge buyer of Iranian oil. Iran relies on those revenues to help keep its economy going. The US has imposed many sanctions on Iran, so its economy is struggling under those sanctions, but Chinese purchases of oil from Iran are helping sustain its economy, just as Chinese purchases of Russian oil are also helping sustain the Russian economy. So there are ties between the two. China continues to carry on commercial economic relations with Iran. And I think the US would obviously like China not to do that because both, the Trump and Biden administrations have hoped that sanctions could compel Iran to curb some of its more hostile activities, but that's not happening right now. And China's commercial engagement with Iran helps give Iran a form of an economic lifeline. But again, I don't think the two countries are ideologically aligned in any way.
Before we leave, I want to tell you this is a library. We promote reading, we promote books. I have to tell you, this was a phenomenal book, folks, to read. I highly recommend it. Several others that are more learned than I have recommended it. I would really encourage you all to pick it up and read it. I gotta figure out which way the camera goes. Interestingly, we had a exchange about a year and a half ago with a group of Mongolian librarians that came here to Hudson and visited our library, and they were very interested in the concepts of libraries and how people access information, and they were wonderful people at the time. So the more you learn about foreign cultures and how they impact ours can only benefit us as a world as we go forward. Therefore, pick up the book and read about China and Mr. Wong's family and how they represent that. I want to thank you all. And you'll see on your screen currently, there's a QR code as well as a picture of the book again. The Learned Owl is where you can purchase this, or you can go to any library in the United States and check out this book as well. So thank you, Mr. Wong, for joining us for an hour, answering our questions, and we really appreciate it. And thank you all for attending. I would encourage you to sign in and register for the other Tour of China events this month with the Hudson Library. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot. I would just say support your local bookstores, support your local libraries. And if you decide to read my book for a book club, I'll be glad to show up on video at the book club and talk more about the book and answering questions.
And we hope it's not 6 years again before we have another book from you.
No, I might write faster this time.
Thank you all. Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everyone.